Flight Lieutenant Gordon Buckley pushed the throttles forward and dropped his Tornado GR-1 to 200 feet above the Iraqi desert on the night of January 17th, 1991. Behind him in the two-seat cockpit, his navigator watched the terrain-following radar paint the ridgelines in green. The aircraft was doing 540 knots, wings swept back, carrying two JP-233 airfield denial weapons weighing nearly a ton each. The target was Rumaila, an Iraqi military airfield in the south. 15 Squadron and 9 Squadron, flying from Bahrain and Tabuk, had drawn the assignment nobody at Central Command wanted. Suppress the runways of Saddam Hussein's Air Force from the deck at night in the teeth of Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft guns and SA-7 missiles. The Americans thought the plan was madness. At briefings in Riyadh through the autumn of 1990, US Air Force pilots flying F-15Es and F-111Fs had listened to RAF officers describe the Tornado's low-level attack profile with something between disbelief and pity. American doctrine had moved on. The USAF had spent the 1980s buying stealth, precision-guided munitions, and altitude. The F-117A would strike Baghdad from 20,000 feet with laser-guided bombs. The Tornado, built for a NATO war in Germany against Warsaw Pact armor columns, was designed to skim beneath Soviet radar coverage and crater airfields, with cluster munitions dispensed from directly overhead. It was a machine tuned for a war that had ended in 1989. Buckley's aircraft call sign in the strike package that night was one of 48 Tornado GR-1s deployed to the Gulf under Operation Granby, the British contribution to the coalition effort. The Ministry of Defence had committed them without hesitation when Margaret Thatcher, in one of her last acts before leaving Downing Street on November 28, 1990, promised George Bush that Britain would provide a full air component. John Major inherited the commitment and did not flinch. Air Vice Marshal Bill Ratton, commanding British Air Forces in the theatre, had told his squadrons the Tornado would do what it was designed to do. There was no other weapon in the RAF inventory that could shut down an Iraqi airfield in a single pass. The JP-233 was a British-designed submunition dispenser. 30 runway cratering bomblets and 215 area denial mines cascaded from twin canisters slung beneath the fuselage. To deliver it, the pilot had to fly straight and level directly over the target at low altitude for roughly 7 seconds. There was no evasion during the release. Every anti-aircraft gunner on the airfield could see the aircraft coming, illuminated by its own weapon dispersing beneath it. American pilots had a phrase for what this looked like from above. They called it a suicide run. Buckley crossed the Iraqi border at 300 local time. Ahead he could see the flashes of coalition ordnance already striking targets deeper inside the country. His four-ship formation split into pairs. The Rumaila tower flak began climbing towards them as they crossed the perimeter fence, tracer arcing lazily upwards and then accelerating past the cockpit. His navigator called the release point. The JP-233s dropped clear. The Tornado bucked, unloaded of 2 tons of ordnance, and Buckley hauled it into a hard right turn away from the airfield. Behind him, the submunitions were still falling. Ahead, in the next 36 hours, 2 Tornado crews would not come home. The RAF would lose more aircraft per sortie than any other coalition air arm in the first week of the war. And the American pilots who had laughed in the briefing rooms would stop laughing entirely. The Tornado existed because of a decision taken in Whitehall in the summer of 1968. The Wilson government had cancelled the TSR-2 4 years earlier, in April 1965, and the replacement, an American F-111K order, had collapsed in January 1968, when the pound was devalued and the Treasury refused to authorize the dollar outlay. Dennis Healey, Secretary of State for Defense, needed a strike aircraft for the Royal Air Force to replace the Vulcan, the Canberra, and eventually the Buccaneer. He also needed to keep the British aerospace industry alive. The solution, negotiated with West Germany and Italy through 1968 and 1969, was the Multi-Role Combat Aircraft, MRCA, a collaborative project managed by a tri-national consortium called Panavia, incorporated in Munich in March 1969. The requirement was written for a specific war. NATO planners in the late 1960s expected a Warsaw Pact ground offensive across the North German plain, spearheaded by 3 Soviet tank armies advancing from bases in East Germany and Poland. To blunt such an attack, NATO needed to destroy Warsaw Pact air power on the ground before it could establish air superiority. That meant hitting airfields at Zerbst, Neuruppin, Wittstock, and dozens of others, and hitting them in the first hours of a war. The Soviet Integrated Air Defense System, built around SA-2, SA-3, SA-4, and SA-6 surface-to-air missiles and radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery, made high-altitude attack profiles suicidal. The only way in was underneath the radar in the ground clutter at 200 feet and 500 knots. Air Marshal Sir Dennis Smallwood, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Strike Command from 1971, championed the low-level profile. The Buccaneer, originally a Royal Navy carrier aircraft, had already demonstrated the capability. The Tornado would industrialize it. Its terrain-following radar, developed by Texas Instruments and integrated by British firms, would let the aircraft fly hands-off at night and in cloud, hugging the contours of the Earth at heights where a Soviet fighter's look-down radar could not distinguish it from ground returns. Its variable geometry wings, swept forward for landing, swept back for high-speed dash, allowed short takeoffs from damaged runways, and Mach 1.2 performance at sea level. The first prototype flew from Manching in West Germany on August 14, 1974, piloted by Paul Millett of the British Aircraft Corporation. The RAF received its first production, GR-1, in June 1979. By 1985, the Tornado Force was operational at RAF Marham, RAF Honington, and RAF Bruggen in West Germany, with 220 aircraft eventually delivered to Britain. Each cost roughly £20 million in 1980s money. The programme total across 3 nations exceeded £30 billion. Americans watched the project with polite skepticism. The United States Air Force had chosen a different path. The F-15 Eagle entering service in 1976 and the F-16 Fighting Falcon from 1978 emphasized air superiority and battlefield interdiction from medium altitude. The F-111, which the RAF had once wanted, was already regarded as a compromise. The new F-117A stealth fighter, flying secretly from Tonopah in Nevada from 1981, represented American thinking. Use technology to become invisible, then attack from safe altitudes with precision weapons. British doctrine was different because Britain's assumptions were different. The RAF expected to fight outnumbered against an enemy with saturated air defences in a war that would begin with tactical nuclear release authority already delegated to corps commanders. Survival meant getting below the radar horizon and staying there. Precision was secondary to weight of ordnance delivered on airfield surfaces in the first sortie. The Tornado was optimised for that mission, and the JP-233 dispenser, developed by Hunting Engineering at Ampthill in Bedfordshire, and cleared for service in 1988, was its signature weapon. Then the Berlin Wall came down. The Warsaw Pact evaporated. In Whitehall, planners began drafting the options for change review that would cut the RAF's front line by a third. The Tornado, it seemed, had missed its war. Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. By 600 London time, the Joint Intelligence Committee was assembling in the Cabinet Office briefing room. Percy Cradock, the JIC chairman and Thatcher's foreign policy advisor, presented the assessment that Saddam Hussein would consolidate his hold on Kuwait within 72 hours and might continue south into Saudi Arabia. Thatcher was in Aspen, Colorado, attending a conference where she met George Bush the following day. The exchange between them, Bush uncertain, Thatcher direct, became the founding moment of the coalition. "This is no time to go wobbly, George," she told him, or words very close to it. The phrase entered the historical record through her memoirs and Bush's own account, and although the precise wording is disputed, the substance is not. The Ministry of Defence began planning a British contribution immediately. Tom King, Secretary of State for Defence, chaired a series of meetings at Main Building on Whitehall through the first week of August. Air Chief Marshal Sir David Craig, Chief of the Defence Staff, presented options. The Royal Navy had 2 frigates and a destroyer in the Gulf already. The Armilla Patrol Force established in 1980 during the Iran-Iraq War. The Army could deploy an armoured brigade based on the British Army of the Rhine, though the units in question, the 7th Armoured Brigade at Falklands, would need to strip parts from other regiments to bring their Challenger tanks to full serviceability. The RAF could deploy Tornado F-3 air defence fighters and Jaguar ground attack aircraft within days, and Tornado GR-1 strike aircraft within weeks. The first RAF deployment, 12 Tornado F-3s of 5 Squadron and 29 Squadron, arrived at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia on August 11, 1990. 12 Jaguars of 6 Squadron, 41 Squadron, and 54 Squadron followed to Thumrait in Oman. The Tornado GR-1s came later, deploying in October and November to Muharraq in Bahrain, and eventually forward to Tabuk in northern Saudi Arabia and Dhahran. Air Vice Marshal Andrew Wilson took initial command. Rattan replaced him in December. The politics shifted in London through the autumn. Thatcher lost the Conservative leadership on November 22, 1990, and left Downing Street 6 days later. John Major, previously Chancellor, inherited a war Britain was already committed to fighting. He flew to Washington in December, met Bush at Camp David, and confirmed that the British commitment would stand and would grow. The 7th Armoured Brigade, deploying under Brigadier Patrick Cordingley, would be expanded to a full division, the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Rupert Smith. By January 1991, some 43,000 British service personnel were in theatre. It was the largest British military deployment since Suez. The air planning was run principally by the Americans. General Charles Horner, commanding Central Command Air Forces, held the Master Air Attack Plan in Riyadh. His deputy for planning, Brigadier General Booster Glosson, wrote the initial waves. The British contribution slotted into a coalition scheme that had grown out of the classified Instant Thunder concept, drafted by Colonel John Warden at the Pentagon in August 1990. Warden's theory prioritized strategic targets: leadership, communications, electrical grids, struck from medium altitude by F-117As and Tomahawk cruise missiles. Airfields were on the list, but Warden expected them to be neutralized over time by repeated attacks. The RAF disagreed. Rattan pressed Horner for authorization to hit Iraqi airfields at low level with JP-233 in the first hours. The Iraqi Air Force operated Soviet MiG-29s, MiG-25s, and French Mirage F-1s from hardened bases. If they got airborne in strength, coalition ground attack aircraft, including the vulnerable A-10s and Jaguars, would face contested skies. Horner authorized the plan. On January 15, 1991, the deadline expired. The following night, Buckley and his squadron mates crossed the border. Flight Lieutenants John Peters and John Nichol took off from Muharraq at 08:30 on January 17, 1991, the first morning of the war. Their Tornado GR-1 ZD-791 was part of a formation tasked to attack Shaiba airfield in southern Iraq. The mission profile called for a low-level ingress and a loft attack, with 1,000-pound freefall bombs rather than JP-233. Shaiba's runways were not the priority. The aircraft on them were. The formation crossed into Iraqi airspace shortly after 1000. Peters flew the aircraft. Nichol operated the systems in the back seat. As they approached the target, an SA-16 shoulder-launched missile struck the right side of the fuselage. Peters recalled a violent lurch and the immediate loss of controls. He ordered ejection. Both crewmen went out at approximately 200 feet. Their parachutes opened seconds before ground impact. They came down in the desert north of Basra, injured but alive, and were captured within an hour by Iraqi troops. What followed became the most publicly visible British experience of the war. Peters and Nicholl were beaten, interrogated at length, and paraded on Iraqi television on January 20th. Peters's bruised and swollen face, filmed reading a scripted statement in a monotone, appeared on news bulletins around the world. In Downing Street, John Major watched the broadcast and issued a statement condemning the treatment of prisoners as a breach of the Geneva Conventions. In RAF messes across the Gulf and back in Britain, the images produced a particular kind of anger. Every Tornado crew knew that they might be next. The RAF lost a second Tornado that same day. Squadron leader Nigel Elsdon and Flight Lieutenant Max Collier of 27 Squadron were killed when their aircraft failed to return from an attack on Shaiba. On January 19th, Flight Lieutenants Adrian Nicholl, no relation, and David Waddington were shot down and captured near Talil. On January 20th, Wing Commander Nigel Elsdon's replacement in command and another aircraft from 15 Squadron went down over H3 airfield in western Iraq. By the end of the first week, 6 Tornado GR-1s had been lost. 14 aircrew were dead, captured or missing. The loss rate, approximately 1 aircraft per 40 sorties in the opening phase, was the highest of any coalition type. American commentators noted it in the press. The Washington Post and the New York Times ran pieces questioning the RAF's low-level tactics. The Ministry of Defense, briefing lobby correspondents at Main Building, defended the doctrine but privately reviewed it. Rattan, at his headquarters in Riyadh, faced a decision that could not be delayed. The problem was not the aircraft. The Tornado was performing as designed. The problem was that the Iraqi Air Force had not risen to fight. By January 20th, coalition aircraft had established air superiority over Iraq. The Iraqi fighters were fleeing to Iran or hiding in hardened aircraft shelters. The immediate justification for JP-233 attacks, suppression of Iraqi air power in the first hours, no longer applied. Every JP-233 sortie now exposed a crew to concentrated anti-aircraft fire for a diminishing return. On January 22nd, Rattan authorized a shift. The Tornado force would move to medium-altitude bombing. The problem was that the RAF had no laser designation capability of its own. The GR-1s could carry 1,000-pound bombs and freefall them from height. But without a laser designator, accuracy would be poor. The solution was already inbound. Buccaneer S-2Bs of 12 Squadron and 208 Squadron, based at Lossiemouth in Moray, were being deployed to Muharraq with their PAVE Spike laser designator pods. The elderly Buccaneers, first flown in 1958, would designate targets for the Tornadoes to strike with Paveway, 2 laser-guided bombs. The Buccaneers arrived at Muharraq on 26th of January, 1991. 12 aircraft flew out from Lossiemouth over 4 days, ferry crews handing over to the operational air crew on arrival. The type was scheduled for retirement in 1994. Its deployment to a war zone was a scramble improvised from workshops and squadron stocks. Ground crews at Lossiemouth had worked around the clock through the second half of January to prepare the airframes, applying a hasty pink and cream desert camouflage that the crews nicknamed the Sand and Something scheme. The PAVE Spike pod was American, procured in the late 1970s and integrated onto the Buccaneer to give the RAF a precision strike capability the Tornado had never received. The reasons were institutional. The Tornado had been designed around JP-233 and freefall bombs. Laser designation had been treated as a future upgrade, funded but not fielded. In the interim, the Buccaneer force at Lossiemouth held the RAF's only operational laser designation capability. In peacetime, this had seemed a minor anomaly. In January 1991, it became urgent. The tactic developed in the desert was straightforward. A pair of Buccaneers would fly at medium altitude alongside a formation of 4 Tornado GR-1s. As the Tornadoes approached the target, typically an Iraqi airfield's hardened aircraft shelters, or a bridge or a command bunker, The Buccaneer navigator would acquire the aim point with the Pave Spikes television camera and fire the laser. The Tornadoes released Paveway 2 bombs which guided down the laser beam to the marked spot. Circular error probable was measured in feet rather than tens of yards. A single 1,000-pound bomb, guided accurately, could penetrate a hardened shelter and destroy the aircraft inside. The first Buccaneer-designated strike went in on February 2, 1991 against Suera Road Bridge. The bridge dropped into the Tigris. Over the following 4 weeks, Buccaneers designated 169 laser-guided bomb strikes. The RAF systematically worked through the target list. Airfields at Shaiba, Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah, and Balad. Bridges across the Euphrates. Hardened shelters at H2 and H3. Losses fell almost to zero. After January 22nd, no more Tornado GR1s were shot down. The final tornado loss of the war came on February 14th. Flight Lieutenants Rupert Clark and Steve Hicks were struck by a missile over Al Taqaddum airfield during a laser-guided attack. Both ejected. Clark was captured. Hicks was killed. His death brought the total British air crew fatalities in Operation Granby to 8, with 14 taken prisoner and released at the war's end. Within the RAF, the Buccaneer detachment became known as the Sky Pirates, a reference to the skull and crossbones flag that appeared on several aircraft. American pilots who had seen the Buccaneer only in exercises before the war revised their assessment sharply. The type flew 218 combat sorties in 6 weeks. It suffered no losses. The lesson being absorbed in Whitehall was uncomfortable. The Tornado had been designed for a war that never came. When it fought the war it was actually given, its optimization for low-level penetration of Warsaw-packed defenses had produced casualties disproportionate to results. The salvage operation, Buccaneer designation, Paveway 2 delivery, worked, but it worked because a soon-to-be retired aircraft from the 1960s carried the capability the newer type lacked. In the Ministry of Defense, air staff planners began drafting the requirement that would become the TIALD pod, Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator, which GEC Marconi rushed into service during the war itself. 2 Tornado GR1s at Tabuk received prototype TIALD pods on February 10th and flew their first designation mission 4 days later. The RAF was integrating a new weapon system in the middle of a shooting war. The pace of change was without precedent in modern British air operations. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir David Craig, sat before the House of Commons Defence Committee on February 20th, 1991, while the war was still being fought. MPs wanted to know why Britain had lost so many tornadoes. Craig defended the low-level doctrine as necessary in the war it had been developed for. The Cold War, he reminded the committee, had ended barely 18 months earlier. The Tornado had been procured for a specific set of tactical circumstances that no longer obtained. The rapid adaptation in theatre from JP-233 to medium-altitude paveway delivery demonstrated the RAF's capacity to shift doctrine under pressure. The private assessment within the Ministry of Defence was more searching. The Defence Operational Analysis Establishment at West Byfleet in Surrey began, even before the ceasefire, on February 28th, to compile the lost data for post-conflict review. The findings, circulated in draft through the summer of 1991, were confidential at the time but became substantially public through subsequent parliamentary answers and the memoirs of participants. The core conclusion, JP-233 had worked as designed, but the operational context had changed faster than the procurement cycle. The RAF had bought a weapon system for a war that ended before it could be used, then used it in a different war where its advantages were less pronounced and its vulnerabilities more so. The American assessment delivered by the US Air Force through liaison channels to Whitehall through 1991 and 1992 was more direct. American planners had watched the RAF lose 6 aircraft in the opening week and drawn conclusions. The USAF's own after-action analysis, formalized in the Gulf War Air Power Survey, commissioned by Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice in 1991, emphasized the shift to medium-altitude precision attack as the defining lesson of the war. The British data supported this reading. The Buccaneer Tornado combination had been improvised, but it had worked because it delivered precision at range without exposing crews to point defenses. Yet the fuller reading, which took several years to emerge, was more complicated. The RAF's willingness to accept casualties in the first week had contributed to establishing air superiority. Iraqi commanders, watching British aircraft come in at 200 feet and refuse to be deterred by anti-aircraft fire, had understood that coalition air power would not be denied. The moral dimension of the low-level attacks, professional air crews continuing to press home their runs after squadron mates had been killed, was noted in Iraqi intelligence assessments captured after the war. The RAF's reputation among American pilots shifted markedly. The men who had laughed at low-altitude doctrine in the Riyadh briefing rooms in October found by March that they wanted to fly with the British. Peters and Nicholl were released on March 4, 1991, along with the other British prisoners of war. They flew home to a country that had watched their treatment on television and would over the following years read their accounts. Peters wrote Tornado Down with Nicholl in 1992. The book sold heavily. Nicholl went on to write further accounts of the RAF's Gulf War. The prisoners had become, in a British public discourse still adjusting to the end of the Cold War, the human face of a conflict fought mostly at professional remove. The 8 British aircrew killed in Operation Granby were commemorated at RAF Marham, at Lossiemouth, and eventually at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. Wing Commander Nigel Elston and his navigator, Squadron Leader Gary Lennox and his navigator, Flight Lieutenants Kev Weeks, Steve Hicks, the others. The total losses were small by historical standards. They were substantial by the standards of a post-Cold War world that had expected wars, if fought at all, to be fought at low cost. The larger question, what a British armed force was for once the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, remained unanswered in February 1991. The Options for Change review was already running. Tom King published the Options for Change White Paper on July 25, 1990, 9 days before the invasion of Kuwait. The document proposed cuts of roughly a quarter to the British armed forces, predicated on the diminishing Soviet threat. The RAF would lose over 100 combat aircraft. The British Army of the Rhine would be halved. The Royal Navy's frigate and destroyer force would fall from around 50 to 40. The paper reflected a Whitehall consensus that the peace dividend was real and could be spent. The Gulf War interrupted the implementation but did not overturn the logic. When the war ended in February 1991, and when the Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved on July 1, 1991, and when the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist on December 26, 1991, the strategic environment shifted further. The Ministry of Defense resumed its cuts. RAF Germany, which had housed the Tornado GR-1 force at Brüggen and Laarbruch as the tip of NATO's tactical strike capability, was drawn down through the mid-1990s. Brüggen finally closed in 2001. Laarbruch closed in 1999. The airfields that had existed to launch nuclear and conventional strikes against Warsaw Pact targets reverted to the Bundesluftwaffe or to civilian use. The Tornado itself entered a long second life. The RAF's GR-1 fleet was upgraded through the 1990s to GR-4 standard with better avionics, integrated TIALD as standard, and eventually the Storm Shadow cruise missile. The type served over Bosnia in 1995, Iraq again in 1998 during Operation Desert Fox, Kosovo in 1999, Iraq once more in 2003, Afghanistan from 2009, and Libya in 2011. The airframes designed to fight the Third World War at 200 feet over Germany ended their careers dropping precision weapons from medium altitude over cities in the Middle East. The last operational RAF Tornado sortie flew on March 31, 2019. The Buccaneers Gulf Service was the type's last combat deployment. All Buccaneers were withdrawn from RAF service in March 1994. Several were preserved at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford, at East Fortune in Scotland, and at the Ulster Aviation Society in Northern Ireland. The aircraft that had entered service with the Royal Navy in 1962, designed to deliver a nuclear bomb from below Soviet radar coverage against Sverdlov-class cruisers, retired 32 years later, having delivered its final ordnance as a laser designator for a fleet of Tornadoes over Iraq. The JP-233 was withdrawn from service in 1998, following British ratification of the Convention on Cluster Munitions in Principle, though formal accession came later. The weapon had been used exclusively during Operation Granby. No further JP-233 attacks were ever conducted by the RAF. The submunitions design, effective against runways and area denial, fell foul of the humanitarian concerns that displaced Cold War calculations through the late 1990s and 2000s. The British aircrew who had flown those first missions moved on. Buckley completed his RAF career. Peters left the service and became a public speaker. Nicholl became a broadcaster and writer. Ratton retired as Air Chief Marshal Sir William Ratton in 1997. Cordingley, who had commanded 7th Armoured Brigade in the desert, retired as a Major General in 2000. Rupert Smith, who had commanded the 1st Armoured Division, went on to command UNPROFOR in Bosnia and to write The Utility of Force, one of the important post-Cold War military texts. The men who had drafted the Tornado requirement in Whitehall in 1968 were mostly retired or dead by the time their aircraft fought. Dennis Healy lived until 2015. He rarely discussed the aircraft specifically, though he was clear in his memoirs that the collaborative European projects of the late 1960s had been necessary to preserve British aerospace capability at a moment when the alternatives were unaffordable. Percy Cradock, the JIC chairman who had briefed Thatcher on August 2, 1990, wrote in his 2002 memoir, Know Your Enemy, that the intelligence community had spent 40 years preparing for a war that never came, and then found itself briefing on a war it had not expected. The remark captures something essential about the British Cold War experience. The institutions built between 1945 and 1991, the nuclear deterrent, the British Army of the Rhine, RAF Germany, the Armilla Patrol, GCHQ's Signals Intelligence Networks, MI6's Soviet target operations, the JIC assessments circulated each week to Downing Street, were built for a confrontation that ended without the direct clash they had been designed to survive. When that confrontation ended, the instruments outlived it. The Tornado force procured to fight over the North German plain flew in the Iraqi desert. The Chieftain and Challenger tanks that had been positioned to hold the Fulda Gap maneuvered through Kuwait. The Royal Navy vessels built to hunt Soviet submarines in the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap escorted merchant shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. The intelligence services that had spent 4 decades running agents against Soviet targets pivoted incompletely and with difficulty to counter-proliferation and counter-terrorism. Britain's Cold War, viewed from 1991, had been a period of institutional adaptation to constrained circumstances. The Attlee government's 1947 decision to acquire an independent nuclear weapon, taken in a cabinet subcommittee that met without the full cabinet's knowledge, established a pattern of quiet commitment to great power status at a time when the economic base for such status was eroding. The V-Force, Valiants, Victors, Vulcans that carried the deterrent through the 1950s and into the 1960s was replaced by the Polaris submarines of 1968, and Polaris in turn by the Trident submarines whose first patrol did not begin until 1994. Each transition was contested politically, funded reluctantly by the Treasury, and defended in cabinet by successive prime ministers from Attlee through Macmillan and Wilson to Thatcher. The intelligence war was harder to measure. GCHQ, moving from Bletchley Park to Cheltenham through the late 1940s and 1950s, produced the signals intelligence that shaped British and American assessments of Soviet capabilities. MI6, damaged severely by the Cambridge 5 defections of Burgess, McLean, Philby and Blake through the 1950s and 1960s, rebuilt itself through the 1970s and 1980s under directors including Maurice Oldfield, Arthur Franks and Colin Figures. The Mitrokhin archive, smuggled out of Russia in 1992 through MI6 handling, provided documentary evidence of Soviet operations against Britain across the Cold War period. Christopher Andrews' Authorized History of MI5, published in 2009, drew on files that had been closed for decades. What the Cold War had produced by 1991 was a British defence and intelligence establishment that had spent 46 years thinking about deterrence, escalation control, and the management of a bipolar international system. The habits of that thinking, the JIC's disciplined assessment process, the Cabinet Office's crisis machinery, the professional culture of the armed services, carried forward into a different era. The tornado over our Rumeila on the night of January 17th, 1991 was the product of that culture. So was the improvisation that put a buccaneer alongside it 2 weeks later. So was the willingness of air crews to press home attacks knowing that other crews had not returned. Peter Hennessy, whose histories of the British state during the Cold War drew on files released through the 1990s and 2000s, described the period as one in which Britain had done what was necessary with what was available. The tornado story is a version of that judgment in miniature. A machine built for one war, flown in another, delivered by professionals trained to a standard that survived the transition. The American pilots who had laughed in October had stopped laughing by February. What had ended by the summer of 1991 was not Britain's finest hour, but the long strategic winter that had followed it. What replaced it no one in Whitehall could yet name.